One person made a series of decisions, each worse than the last, and millions of people who did not elect, support, or ask anything of this person paid for each decision. The Second World War was the most bloody conflict in history. 70 million dead, 6 years, dozens of countries. This is the story of how one man with a delusion of grandeur dragged half the planet with him. His name was Adolf Hitler. Today we will go through the entire Second World War through his mistakes. We will number each one, and by the end, you will understand why numbering is pointless. But first, let's figure out how this person even gained power, because without this, nothing else works. 1919, the First World War ended. Germany lost. The victors drafted the Treaty of Versailles. Peaceful. That was in the name. In reality, the conditions were such that only the one who wrote them could call them peaceful. Germany lost territories. The army was reduced to 100,000 people. Reparations were set so high that the country physically could not pay them. The Germans perceived Versailles as a slap in the face, a national humiliation. Hatred built up for 20 years, and when a man appeared who promised to restore greatness, they listened to him. Adolf Hitler, a former corporal of the First World War, an artist who was twice rejected by the Academy of Arts, a man without military education, without aristocratic background, without any real grounds to consider himself a strategic genius. But he spoke in such a way that audiences would rise, and in 1933 he gained power. Then he began to dismantle the Versailles Order piece by piece. He rebuilt the army, sent troops into the Rhineland demilitarized zone, annexed Austria, and took the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Each time Britain and France turned a blind eye, the policy of appeasement, as if maybe if we give him another piece, he will calm down. It was like feeding a crocodile and hoping it would become a vegetarian. The British Prime Minister Chamberlain brought back a paper from Munich with Hitler's signature and proudly declared that it was peace for our generation. Spoiler, it was peace for 11 months. On August 23, 1939, the whole world choked on coffee. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. Molotov and Ribbentrop shook hands. Two regimes that ideologically hated each other agreed not to fight. A secret protocol divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Stalin was buying time, or thought he was. Hitler was freeing his hands in the West. Both believed they had outsmarted the other. Both were wrong. Alright, enough with the backstory. Let's go over the mistakes. Mistake number 1. On the 1st of September, 1939, Germany invades Poland. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. A new doctrine. Tanks, dive bombers, motorized infantry. A punch with a fist, not with splayed fingers. Concentration of forces at one point. Breakthrough, encirclement, destruction. Poland is crushed in 5 weeks. On the 3rd of September, Britain and France declare war on Germany. But here's what's interesting. They declared war but did not start fighting. They literally did nothing. The armies stood at the border and watched each other for half a year. This was called the phony war, like two people who argued in correspondence but pretend nothing happened when they meet. While France and Britain were thinking, Hitler was acting. On the 17th of September, the Soviet Union sent troops into eastern Poland under the terms of a secret protocol. Poland disappeared from the map again. Then there was the Winter War. The USSR invaded Finland in the winter of 1939. The Red Army, which was dozens of times larger than the Finnish, got bogged down in the snow and suffered monstrous losses. The Finns fought like madmen and inflicted such damage on the Soviet Union that the whole world decided the Red Army was a paper tiger. Hitler also took notice and remembered. This Finnish war reinforced his belief that the USSR was weak and would collapse from a single blow. This was a mistake, but more on that later. In the spring of 1940, Hitler strikes Western Europe. Denmark capitulated in 6 hours. I did not make a typo. Is 6 hours. I did not make a typo. 6 hours. The Germans arrived in the morning. By lunchtime, Denmark had surrendered. This is not even a blitzkrieg. It's a blitz without the krieg. Norway held out for 2 months. Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg fell one after another like dominoes. And then France, one of the strongest armies in Europe. The Maginot Line, concrete fortifications that were built over years. Everyone was sure the Germans would be stopped by them, but the Germans simply bypassed them. A tank strike through the Ardennes forests, which the French General Staff considered impassable for armored vehicles. You know, there are people who say, you can't pass here, and you check, and indeed you can't. But there are German tankers of 1940 who checked and passed. 6 weeks later, France signed the capitulation. 6 weeks. The country that held out for 4 years in the First World War fell in 1.5 months. If it were football, the coach would have gone to the locker room in the first half and the commentator would have stopped counting goals. 340,000 British and French soldiers were pinned to the sea at Dunkirk. The situation is hopeless. And here begins one of those stories that is hard to believe, but they are real. Evacuation on anything available. Destroyers, fishing boats, pleasure boats, yachts, civilian boats. Ordinary people who took their vessels into the English Channel under bombs to take soldiers from the beach. 340,000 people were evacuated in 9 days. Hitler could have ordered the tanks to finish them off, but he stopped the tanks. Why? Historians still argue about it. Some say he was preserving the equipment, others that he wanted to give Göring a chance to bomb them from the air. In any case, 340,000 people sailed away. Then they will return on the other shore with friends. In the summer and fall of 1940, the Luftwaffe bombs Britain. The Battle of Britain. London is on fire. Coventry is erased. Port cities burn night after night, but Britain does not surrender. Churchill, who replaced Chamberlain, delivers speeches that make people's hair stand on end. We shall fight on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets. We shall never surrender. And they did not surrender. The Royal Air Force fought in the air every day, losing pilots but not losing the sky. This was Hitler's first strategic defeat. He could not break the island, and instead of finishing the job, he does something incredible. Mistake number 2, he turns east to the Soviet Union. A war on two fronts, the German nightmare of the 19th century, what all German strategists had warned about for the last 50 years. The generals are in shock. Hitler responds that the Soviet Union is a colossus with feet of clay. He says that just one kick is enough, and the whole rotten structure will collapse. He liked how the Finns drove the Red Army through the snowdrifts. He decided he could do better. On June 22nd, 1941, at 4 o'clock in the morning, dawn, and into this silence burst 3,800,000 Axis countries, simultaneously crossing the Soviet border on a front 2,900 kilometers long. Operation Barbarossa is the largest military invasion in human history. Nothing even remotely similar happened before or after. 3 strikes. Army Group North heads to Leningrad. Army Group Center is heading to Moscow. Army Group South is heading to Ukraine. 3,500 tanks, almost 3,000 airplanes. And on the other side, a country that is not prepared for this invasion. Stalin received warnings, dozens. Richard Sorge, a Soviet spy in Tokyo, provided the exact date of the attack. Defectors warned, British intelligence warned, Stalin ignored everything. He forbade the troops from moving to positions, forbade dispersing the aviation, forbade preparing for defense. To quote the essence, not to provoke Hitler. Not to provoke a person who by this point had captured Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, Yugoslavia, and Greece. But Stalin was afraid that if our troops started digging trenches, Hitler would take offense.
Damn, just damn. The first day of Barbarossa became a disaster. The Soviet Air Force lost about 1,200 aircraft in the first day. Most were destroyed right on the airfields, and
they stood wing to wing, neatly lined up like in a parade, perfect targets. Commanders who would order the equipment to disperse risked a tribunal for provocation, so the planes stood and burned. But there were places where the fighting started from the first minute. The Brest fortress right on the border. The Germans expected to take it in hours. The garrison resisted for more than a month without reinforcements, without orders, without communication with the outside world. On the fortress walls, they later found an inscription scratched with a bayonet. "I am dying, but I do not surrender." Farewell Motherland, July 20th, 1941. A month after the war began, this man did not know that Minsk had long since fallen, that the front had moved hundreds of kilometers to the east. He simply held the wall because he didn't know how to do otherwise. In the first weeks and months, the Germans encircled entire armies. Near Minsk, 300,000 prisoners. Near Uman, 100,000. Near Kyiv in September, 650,000. The scale of the losses was such that the mind refused to believe it. These are not numbers, these are the populations of entire cities trapped in encirclement. On the 8th of September, the blockade of Leningrad begins. And here, we need to pause because the blockade is one of those stories after which you will never be the same. The city is completely surrounded. 2.5 million people are trapped inside. Supplies only through Lake Ladoga. In winter, over the ice, along the road of life, in summer by water under constant bombing. Bread rations fell to 125 grams per day, a piece the size of a palm for the whole day. People boiled carpentry glue, ate belts. They stripped off the wallpaper because the paste underneath was made with flour. In the winter of 1941 to 42, the heating didn't work. There was no electricity, no water. The temperature was -30. People froze in their apartments. The blockade lasted 872 days. About 800,000 civilians died of hunger. This is more than those who died in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, and the city did not surrender. The Kirov plant continued to produce tanks just a few kilometers from the front line. Shostakovich composed the 7th Symphony in the besieged city. The symphony was broadcast over loudspeakers, and the Germans heard it from their trenches. I will not joke about this. There's nothing to joke about here. By October of 1941, the Germans were 30 kilometers from Moscow. The advance patrols could see the Kremlin towers through binoculars. The last tram stop on the Moscow line was Khimki. Moscow was preparing for evacuation. Factories were being mined, documents burned. Mistake number 3. Back in the summer, when the path to Moscow was almost open, Hitler interfered in operational command, took Guderian's tanks from the central direction and redirected them south to Kyiv. The generals were furious. Halder, the chief of the general staff, noted in his diary that the Führer was making decisions contrary to any military logic. The encirclement near Kyiv became grandiose, but Moscow gained 2 months of time. Autumn rains, mud, then frosts, for which the Wehrmacht was not prepared. Soldiers in summer uniforms, equipment that wouldn't start at -30, while fresh divisions from Siberia and the Far East arrived in winter gear with T-34 tanks, which German armored vehicles struggled to handle. On the 5th of December, Zhukov launched a counteroffensive near Moscow. This was the first major defeat of the Wehrmacht in the Second World War. The Germans were pushed back 150 to 200 kilometers. The Blitzkrieg failed. The war that was supposed to end in 2 months turned into a meat grinder for which Germany was not prepared in terms of resources, manpower, or psychology. Meanwhile, Mussolini. Every time this man got involved somewhere, things got worse. Italy invaded Greece and was defeated by the Greeks. Italy ventured into North Africa and was defeated by the British. Each time Hitler had to divert valuable divisions to rescue an ally that was as helpful as a fifth wheel on a wagon. Imagine you're playing a cooperative game and you have a teammate who dies first every round and asks to be revived while you're barely surviving. Mistake number 4. Summer of 1942. Hitler wants the oil of the Caucasus. Without fuel, the war cannot be waged. This is his only decision. The only decision of his that at least had strategic logic. But on the way to the oil stands a city on the Volga, Stalingrad. Hitler wants to take it, partly for strategic reasons, partly because the city bears Stalin's name. Stalin does not intend to give it up. Also partly for strategic reasons, partly because the city bears his name. 2 dictators, 2 egos, and between them, a city where hundreds of thousands of people will die. Order 227, not a step back. Barrier troops are behind, deserters are shot. By September, General Paulus's 6th Army enters the city, and battles begin that the world has never seen before. This is no longer a front in the classical sense. It's a fight for every house, every entrance, every room. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War. Snipers fired from the ruins. Hand-to-hand combat took place in the basements. Positions changed several times a day. The front line ran through the floors of a single building. One German soldier wrote home that they had captured the kitchen, but the living room was still with the Russians. This was not humor, it was a literal report on their progress.
The average life expectancy of a soldier arriving in Stalingrad was about 1 day, for an officer about 3. Pavlov's house, an ordinary 4-story residential building on 9th of January Square. A group of 25 Soviet soldiers under the command of Sergeant Yakov Pavlov turned it into a fortress. They mined the approaches, broke through walls between apartments for maneuvering, and set up machine guns on the upper floors. 58 days. 25 people held the house for 58 days. The Germans lost more people storming this one house than in the capture of Paris. When I am told about resilience and courage, I remember this house. On the 19th of November 1942, Operation Uranus begins, the Soviet counter-offensive. A strike with 2 pincers on the flanks of the 6th Army, which were covered by Romanian and Italian units. Mussolini again. Yes, his troops on the flank collapsed within hours. 4 days later, the ring closed. 300,000 Germans found themselves in a cauldron. Paulus contacted the command, asking for permission to break through. The chance was still narrow but real. Manstein's tanks were coming to the rescue from outside. If Paulus had struck to meet them, a breakthrough was possible. Hitler forbade it, ordered them to hold on, promised supply by air. Göring assured that the Luftwaffe would deliver 300 tons of supplies per day. In reality, on the best days, they delivered about 100, more often 60. The army began to starve, then freeze, then die. They ate the horses, ate the cats, ate the mice. The ammunition was running out. The medical supplies were gone. The wounded lay in cellars without help. On the 31st of January, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered. The day before, Hitler had specially promoted him to the rank of Field Marshal. It was a hint. No German field marshal in history had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to shoot himself. Paulus understood the hint and ignored it. He went out to the Soviet officers and surrendered. 91,000 German soldiers were captured, of whom about 5,000 would return home after the war. Stalingrad became a turning point, the bloodiest battle in human history. The total losses on both sides were about 2 million people killed, wounded and captured. After Stalingrad, Germany would never again seize the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. Never. Mistake number 5. Summer of 43, the Kursk Bulge. And here we need to pause, because the scale of what happened near Kursk is impossible to grasp at first. The largest tank battle in history, not one of the largest, but the largest. Period. More than 6,000 tanks on one field, 4,000 airplanes, about 2 million people. Imagine all of this simultaneously in an area 200 by 100 kilometers.
Hitler threw everything he had left here. The newest tanks, Tiger and Panther, which were supposed to turn the tide of the war. The Tiger weighed 50 tons. Its frontal armor could not be penetrated by any Soviet gun at standard range. The Panther was faster, more maneuverable, with a long-barreled gun.
On paper, this was supposed to work, but the paper did not account for one thing. Soviet intelligence knew about the German plans in advance. Zhukov and Rokossovsky convinced Stalin not to, They convinced Stalin not to attack first, but to let the Germans get bogged down in defense. For 2 months, the Red Army prepared positions, 8 lines of fortifications in depth, minefields with a density of up to 2,000 mines per kilometer of front, anti-tank ditches, artillery ambushes, and camouflaged positions that could not be seen from the air. On the 5th of July, the Germans launched an attack. The ground trembled from the roar of thousands of engines, and they got bogged down. Tanks were blown up by mines. Artillery knocked them out one by one. Tigers, which were supposed to be invincible, broke down on the march because their gearboxes couldn't handle the load. Panthers burned due to engine overheating. Equipment that took 6 months to make failed within hours. A week later, Hitler cancelled the operation. The Allies landed in Sicily and reserves needed to be transferred. After Kursk, the German army on the Eastern Front was only retreating, only moving back. 2 years of continuous retreat all the way to Berlin, while on the other side of the world there was another war, the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and drew the United States into the war. Midway in 42, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, island by island, the Americans advanced towards Japan. But that is a separate story and it deserves its own video. Mistake number 6. Although at this point, numbering is already pointless. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Normandy. And here you need to understand the scale. 160,000 soldiers, 5,000 ships, 13,000 airplanes, the largest landing operation in history. The world had never seen anything like it before or since. At night, before dawn, paratroopers jump behind the defense lines in the dark, blindly. Many land in swamps, drowning under the weight of their equipment. Gliders land in fields, breaking upon landing. Chaos, but the bridges are captured, roads are blocked, the Germans cannot send reinforcements. At dawn, the landing begins. 5 beaches: Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Omaha is the worst. Waves of soldiers run across the sand under machine gun fire. The first boats open their ramps and people fall even before they step onto the shore. The water is red, the sand is red, but they keep going. Behind them is the English Channel. Ahead is Fortress Europe. There is nowhere to retreat. By evening, the beaches are taken. The Western Front is open. Germany is now squeezed between 2 giant armies that are slowly, inexorably tightening the ring. In the same month, the Soviet Union begins Operation Bagration in Belarus. And here, one must understand the scale. If today involved 160,000, on the first day then 1.5 million Soviet soldiers participated in Bagration. Pnin the scale and descrite. Army Group Center, the same one that in 41 was rushing towards Moscow, is destroyed. The Wehrmacht's losses are about 400,000 people in 2 months. This is a catastrophe on the scale of Stalingrad, but few in the West know about it, and they should. Soviet troops advance 600 kilometers and reach the borders of Germany. On the 20th of July 1944, German officers attempt to kill Hitler. The Stauffenberg plot. A bomb explodes in the staff room. Hitler survives. With injuries, a concussion, but survives. The conspirators are executed. After this, Hitler trusts his generals even less, and before that, he trusted them about as much as you trust the weather forecast for next week. By the beginning of 1945, it's all over. Everyone understands this. The generals understand, the soldiers understand, the civilians understand. Everyone except for one person who sits in a bunker under the Reich Chancellery and moves divisions on a map that no longer exists. Generals report to him on the situation and he orders a counterattack with forces that exist only in his mind.
January 1945, Vistula-Oder operation. The Red Army enters the territory of the Reich. The population flees to the west. Roads are clogged with refugees. Columns of people in the January cold. Women with children, the elderly. The war that Hitler unleashed returned to those in whose name he started it. April. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers stand at the gates of Berlin, the city from which orders once came that destroyed tens of millions of lives. Now an army with very personal scores to settle has approached this city. The assault begins on April 16th. The Silo Heights are the last fortified line before the capital. Zhukov ordered 143 searchlights to be turned on to blind the defenders. The light hit the eyes of the German soldiers. But the smoke and dust from the artillery preparations scattered the beams, and instead of blinding the enemy, the spotlights blinded the attackers. The first day's assault failed. The losses were enormous. Zhukov was later criticized for this decision, but the heights were taken in 4 days.
Street fighting in Berlin. Every block, every house, every basement.
Barricades made of overturned trams and furniture, snipers in windows, Panzerfausts from basements. Soviet tankers covered their vehicles with bed frames and metal sheets so that the Panzerfausts would detonate before reaching the armor. The last defenders of Berlin, boys from the Hitler Youth, 14 to 15 years old men from the Volkssturm, over 60. Children and grandfathers, almost no one in between. An entire generation of men was ground down on the Eastern Front. They stood on the barricades with Panzerfausts in their hands because they were told to stand. Some believed, most were simply afraid. Abandoned to die for a man who sat in a bunker 8 meters deep and had long ceased to distinguish reality from his own fantasies. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself in his bunker. He was 56 years old. The man who promised a 1,000-year Reich did not make it to 13. Next to him was Eva Braun, whom he married the day before. The bodies were burned in the courtyard. The war that began with parades and victory marches ended with a burning corpse in a ditch. On the 1st of May, Soviet soldiers raised the flag over the Reichstag. On the 8th of May, Germany signed an unconditional surrender. In Moscow, they learned about it on the 9th. Victory Day. For us, it is the 9th of May, and it is not just a date on the calendar, but the war is not over yet. On the other side of the planet, Japan continues to fight. On the 6th of August, 1945, an atomic bomb falls on Hiroshima, and on the 9th, on Nagasaki. The world saw a weapon capable of destroying a city in a second. On the 2nd of September, Japan signed the surrender. The Second World War is over. In total, 6 years, 70 million dead, 27 million of them citizens of the Soviet Union, soldiers, women, children, the elderly. Every fifth victim of this war lived on our land. The Siege of Leningrad claimed 800,000 lives from hunger alone. The Holocaust exterminated 6 million Jews. Entire nations were put through the machine of destruction. These are not numbers, these are people. 80% of the Wehrmacht's losses occurred on the Eastern Front. 80 out of every 5 German soldiers who died in the Second World War, 4 died in the East. This war was not won in one place or by one country. But if you ask where its fate was decided, the answer is one: between Moscow and Berlin, in the snows under Stalingrad, on the Kursk bulge, in the trenches dug by our grandfathers. There were not 6 mistakes, there were dozens, but each had the same root: a person who considered themselves infallible, who did not listen to the generals, did not trust intelligence, did not acknowledge reality, who forbade retreat when it was necessary to retreat, who threw armies into encirclements, forbidding breakthroughs, and who in the end preferred to destroy his own country, his own people, and himself, rather than admit he was wrong. The war began with a Blitzkrieg in Poland and ended with a flag over the Reichstag. The one who started it burned himself in the courtyard of his own bunker, and the world counts the dead and will continue to count for a long time. subscribe. And if you have a family story related to this war, write it in the comments. Someone's grandfather fought, someone's great-grandfather didn't return, someone's grandmother survived the blockade. These stories must not be lost, because as long as we remember, they are alive.